At 9:18 on a Thursday night, while most of Briar Glen was already behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the county dispatcher heard a woman breathing too hard into the emergency line. The call did not begin with an address. It began with a name, then a sob, then the sentence that would be replayed on local television so many times that people in town started to believe they had heard it live. "My friend is missing," the woman said. "Mara is missing. Please. I think something happened to her." The dispatcher, Nina Pike, had been taking reports of wind damage all evening. A warm front had broken over the valley before sunset, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office, dropping small branches across Melrose Road, and knocking power out in 2 neighborhoods near the old canal. Nina had expected more calls about sparking wires or flooded basements. She straightened in her chair when she heard the woman's voice, because panic had a different sound from inconvenience. Panic made people forget to breathe. "Ma'am, tell me your name and where you are." "Sloan Vetter. I'm at my shop, Vetter Frames on Gable Street. I was supposed to meet her here at 8. She never came. Her phone is going straight to voicemail. Her mother hasn't heard from her. Nobody has. This is not like her." Nina kept her voice even. "Who is Mara?" "Mara Bell," Sloan said, as though the dispatcher ought to know. "Mara Bell from the guidance office at North Briar Middle. She's 29. She has brown hair, about 5'6", green coat, black boots. She wears this little gold necklace, a round one with a bird on it. She never takes it off." It sounded prepared only because Sloan spoke fast, the way frightened people spoke when they had spent an hour rehearsing awful possibilities alone. She gave Mara's apartment address, the make of Mara's car, the name of Mara's mother. Then she gave one more name, hesitating before it, as if she understood that once she said it, another life would split open. "She was supposed to talk to Owen tonight," Sloan said. "Owen Trask, her ex. He's been calling again. She told me she was scared to see him by herself." The first deputy reached Vetter Frames in 11 minutes. The shop stood between an insurance office and a shuttered bakery, its front window full of framed photographs of barns, river bends, pale brides, hunting dogs, and old soldiers in uniforms with their hands resting on the shoulders of grandchildren. The sign above the door was painted the color of dried sage. Sloan had left every light on. She was 32, small-boned, with dark hair twisted in a knot that had come loose during her crying. She wore a canvas apron dusted with mat-board lint, and her hand shook as she unlocked the door for Deputy Chris Bellamy. He noticed a mug of untouched tea on the counter, a stack of framed samples spread like playing cards, and a half-finished panorama of the canal bridge clamped beneath the workbench glass. The back room smelled of sawdust, glue, and the faint metallic tang of wet tools. Sloan kept saying she should have called sooner. She said Mara was punctual, in a way that made other people feel untidy. Mara did not vanish into silence. Mara did not skip dinner plans. Mara texted when she was 5 minutes late, because her mother had raised her to believe that worry was a cost one should not impose on others. Deputy Bellamy asked when Sloan last heard from Mara. Sloan unlocked her phone and showed him a thread of messages. At 6:42, Mara had written, "He asked me to meet him near the old turntable, said he'll stop bothering me if I just listen." At 6:43, Sloan had replied, "Don't go alone." At 7:06, Mara, "I'm only going for 10 minutes. At 7:11, Sloan, "Call me when you leave." At 7:38, Mara, "If I'm not there by 8, please don't let them say I'm being dramatic." After that, nothing. The old turntable sat beyond the freight depot at the edge of town, a circular scar of rusted rail once used to rotate locomotives before the canal was widened and the railroad moved north. Teenagers drank there in summer. Men walked dogs there when they wanted to be alone. At night, it was black enough that a person could stand 20 yards from the road and disappear. By 10 o'clock, 2 deputies were searching the turntable with flashlights. By midnight, they had found Mara's car parked crookedly near the depot access road, locked, with her purse inside and no sign of her. Her phone was not in the car. Her keys were gone. Her green coat was gone. On the muddy ground near the passenger side, Deputy Bellamy saw heel marks and a partial print from a heavy work boot. The rain had already softened both. Owen Trask became the first shadow over the case before dawn. He was 35, a carpenter with a quiet temper and a long record of being in the wrong place when people needed someone to blame. He had dated Mara for 8 months, and the relationship had ended badly enough that Mara's mother, Grace Bell, remembered the final argument through a closed kitchen window. Owen had left 3 voicemails the previous week. In one of them, his voice was low and rough with anger. "You don't get to make me the villain and walk away clean," he had said. When detectives knocked on his door at 6:20 the next morning, Owen looked exhausted, but not surprised. He admitted he had called Mara. He admitted he had asked to see her. He denied meeting her that night. He said he had spent the evening repairing cabinets in an unoccupied rental on Chapel Lane, alone, with the radio on until nearly 9. There were no cameras at the rental. No neighbor had seen him come or go. His truck tires were damp with the same red-brown mud that lay near the turntable. He had a scratch below his left eye and a split knuckle. He said a shelf had slipped. Nobody wrote that down with much confidence. Sloane sat in the interview room later that morning with a paper cup of water untouched between her hands. She looked younger under the fluorescent light. Detective Irene Valdez, who had worked missing person cases long enough to mistrust both tears and calmness, watched the way Sloane answered. She was frightened, specific, and cooperative. She told the story without reaching for details she had not already given. She corrected herself twice on small matters, saying Mara had promised to come by the shop around 8 rather than at 8, and that Mara had said she felt cornered, not exactly scared. Corrections like that made her believable. "She always wore the necklace?" Valdez asked. "Always," Sloane said. Her eyes moved to the table. It was her mother's before it was hers. Gold chain, round pendant, a little swallow etched in the front. The clasp was crooked because it broke when we were in college, and I fixed it with pliers. Badly. Mara said she liked it that way, because it reminded her things could keep working, even when they looked wrong. "How close were you two?" Sloane wiped beneath one eye. "Close enough that she called me before she called her mother. Close enough that I knew she was ashamed of still being afraid of Owen." That sentence stayed with Valdez, not because it sounded false, but because it sounded useful. It gave Owen a shape. It gave the case a direction. For the first week, the direction held. Search teams walked both sides of the canal and pushed through the cattails below the freight depot. Divers went into the black water under the lock gates. Volunteers taped Mara's photograph to gas pumps, pharmacy doors, church bulletins, and the checkout counter at Dawson's Market. The photograph showed her smiling in a cream sweater, the swallow pendant resting against her collarbone like a small coin of sunlight. People began to mention the necklace, even when they did not mention her face. It made Mara feel findable. A woman with a marked object could be noticed. A woman with a necklace that never came off had not simply wandered out of herself. Sloane was everywhere in those first days. She organized the sign-up sheets. She brought thermoses to the canal. She stood beside Grace Bell at a press conference, one hand on the older woman's shoulder, her own face pale and bare of makeup. When a reporter asked whether Mara might have left voluntarily, Sloane answered before Grace could. Mara loved her work. She loved her mother. She would never do this to the people who love her. It was the answer the town wanted. Briar Glen was small enough to make absence personal and large enough to make gossip efficient. By the end of the month, most people believed Owen had done something to Mara at the turntable and hidden it better than anyone expected. They believed it not because there was proof, but because the story was already shaped like a truth. An anxious ex-boyfriend, a meeting near a dark old railroad scar, a locked car, a final message, a missing necklace. Owen's life collapsed without an arrest. His work dried up. A woman spat near his boots outside the courthouse after a hearing on an unrelated traffic charge. His sister stopped letting her children visit his house. He kept telling anyone who would listen that he had not seen Mara that night. But innocence said too often began to sound like a habit, not a fact. Detective Valdez was less certain. There were problems. Mara's phone had last connected to a tower east of town at 8:52, not near the turntable. The tower's range was broad enough to include Gable Street, the freight depot, a section of Canal Road, and half of North Briar, so it proved little. Still, it did not settle neatly. The boot print near Mara's car matched a common work sole sold at 3 stores in the county. Owen owned a pair, but so did half the contractors in town. The scratch on his face could have come from a falling shelf. The split knuckle could have come from anything. The messages on Mara's phone were more troubling. They sounded like Mara, but they did not feel exactly like her to Grace Bell, who had read every postcard her daughter had sent since summer camp. Mara used periods when she was upset, not fragments. She wrote okay, not okay. She never used the phrase being dramatic about herself. That was someone else's phrase, Grace said. That was how other people dismissed her. But grief often turned punctuation into prophecy. Valdez had seen families read hidden codes in grocery lists and birthday cards because the alternative was to accept that the dead, if dead, could no longer explain themselves. The lab could not prove the messages were forged. Mara's phone remained missing. Sloan had no apparent motive to lie. The case pressed forward where it could, then slowed where it could not. Winter sealed the canal edges in gray ice. Spring loosened them. Summer brought algae to the lock gates and a new set of missing posters, smaller this time, printed by Sloan at her own expense. The 1-year anniversary vigil took place on the lawn beside North Briar Middle. Students Mara had counseled placed paper lanterns along the walkway. Grace Bell stood at the microphone and read a letter to her daughter in a voice that broke only once, when she reached the part about leaving the porch light on. Sloan stood behind her, holding a framed photograph of Mara in both hands. The frame was walnut, handmade, the corners joined so cleanly that several people remarked on it afterward. A brass plaque at the bottom read, "Bring her home." When the case turned cold, it did not freeze all at once. It lost heat by degrees. A tip about a woman matching Mara's description in a bus station outside Corbin led nowhere. A fisherman reported seeing a green coat snagged beneath a dock. It turned out to be a tarp. An anonymous email claimed Owen had confessed in a bar, but the bartender denied it, and the sender vanished behind a borrowed Wi-Fi signal. Detectives searched a gravel pit after a cadaver dog showed interest near a pile of discarded insulation, then found only deer bones. Each disappointment made the next lead harder to believe and easier to ignore. Sloan kept the story alive better than the sheriff's office did. She maintained a page called Find Mara Bell, posting memories, photographs, candlelight announcements, and short updates phrased with disciplined hope. She walked with Grace on Sundays. She delivered framed copies of Mara's picture to the school, the church, and the library. She refused payment when families brought in photographs of sons graduating, mothers retiring, dogs aging into white muzzles. For Mara, she would say, and people trusted her for remembering how fragile a life could be. 2 years passed. By then, the missing posters had faded to the color of weak tea. Owen Trask had moved 40 miles south and taken work under a contractor who paid in cash and did not ask questions. Grace Bell still kept Mara's room dusted, but had stopped washing the sheets every month. Detective Valdez had been promoted to sergeant, and spent more time on budgets than on the open boxes in the cold case closet. Sloane's shop had changed too. She painted the sign deep blue, added a line of handmade mirrors, and hired a part-time assistant named Calla Rowe, who was 20 and nervous around customers, but careful with glass. The necklace came back on a wet April afternoon, not from the canal, not from Owen's truck, not from any place the first investigation had imagined. It fell out of a picture frame in the basement of the Briar Glen Public Library. The library had bought the frame at the first anniversary silent auction. It held a black and white photograph of the old canal bridge, taken years earlier by a retired science teacher. The frame had hung in the upstairs reading room beside the local history shelves until a roof leak stained the mat and warped the backing paper. A volunteer named Beth Ansell carried it downstairs to see whether the photograph could be saved. Beth was a retired dental hygienist, the kind of woman who labeled freezer containers and sharpened pencils before they went dull. She set the frame on a padded table, slit the brown dust paper with a craft knife, and heard something shift inside. At first, she thought it was a loose hanging bracket. Then, a small, dark coil slid from between the backing board and the photograph, dropped onto the table, and lay there like a dead insect. Beth did not scream. She simply took one step back. The chain was gold, kinked and broken near the clasp. The pendant was round, no larger than a dime, with the faint engraving of a swallow on its face. Along one side of the chain, dried blood had hardened into the links so completely that the metal looked rusted. A thread of pale fabric clung to the broken clasp. On the back of the pendant, partly obscured by the stain, were two initials engraved so shallowly they could be seen only when Beth turned on the magnifying lamp. M.B. Beth called the police because she had lived in Briar Glen long enough to know that some objects carried their own names. Sergeant Valdez arrived at the library before the evidence technician. She stood in the basement doorway and looked at the necklace through the clear lid of the container Beth had found for it. For a moment, all the old details returned with a force that made the room seem smaller. Sloane's trembling hands, Grace Bell's porch light, Owen Trask's rough voicemail, the muddy turntable, Mara's face repeated on posters until the ink faded. "Who donated the frame?" Valdez asked. Beth looked at the back of the damaged photograph. It came from the auction. The tag says Vetter Frames. Valdez did not speak for several seconds. Evidence moves differently when it appears late. At the beginning of an investigation, a necklace would have been one fact among many. After 2 years of absence, it became a door opening in a wall everyone had stopped touching. The lab confirmed what the room had already understood. The blood in the chain matched Mara Bell through a sample taken from her hairbrush and confirmed against Grace. The fabric thread on the clasp came from a green wool blend consistent with the coat Mara had been wearing the night she vanished. There was skin material under the bent prong of the pendant loop, too degraded for a full profile at first, but enough to show a mixture. Mara was one contributor. The second was female. The frame itself became evidence. That was when the case began to turn away from Owen. The dust paper on the back carried Sloane Vetter's shop stamp, but that alone meant nothing. Everyone knew she had made the frame. More important were the materials hidden beneath the paper. The inner mat was cut from a batch of museum board delivered to Vetter Frames 3 days after Mara disappeared. The linen hinging tape came from a supplier Sloane had not used until the following winter. Someone had opened or assembled the frame after the disappearance, placed the necklace inside the cavity between the photograph and backing board, and sealed it well enough that no one noticed for almost 2 years. Valdez drove to Vetter Frames that evening with Detective Malcolm Reese, who had joined the department after the original investigation and knew the case mostly through the shape of its silence. Sloane was helping a customer choose a frame for a child's watercolor when the detectives entered. She looked up, smiled automatically, then saw Valdez and lost the smile in a way too quick to be staged. "Irene," she said. "Is it Mara?" Valdez watched her hands. They moved to the counter, palms down, fingers spread. Not shaking, bracing. "We found her necklace." For 1 second, Sloane looked relieved. It was a clean, bright flash, gone almost before Valdez could name it. Then Sloane covered her mouth and bent forward, and the grief arrived. "Where?" "In a frame from the library." Sloane blinked. "What frame?" "The Canal Bridge photograph from the memorial auction." Sloane shook her head slowly. "That's impossible. I made that frame before the auction. I donated it. I don't understand." "When did you make it?" "I don't remember exactly. Around the vigil. The week before, maybe. The backing board was delivered to your shop after Mara vanished." A small silence opened. Sloane looked toward the back room, where a mat cutter rested beneath a strip light and long drawers held paper sorted by shade. "I make a lot of frames," she said. "I repair things. People bring old frames in. I reuse materials sometimes. Maybe the board was replaced later." "By whom?" "I don't know." "The library." "Another shop." "The dust paper was yours. The seal was yours. The tape was yours." Sloane's eyes filled again, but this time Valdez saw the calculation behind them, the mind moving quickly through rooms and dates. "Are you saying I put it there?" "I'm asking how Mara Bell's bloody necklace ended up inside a frame from your shop." "I have no idea," Sloane said, "and I hate that you're asking me like that." People in Briar Glen heard about the necklace before the sheriff's office held a press briefing. They heard it from Beth's cousin, who worked at the diner, from the librarian's husband, who told a man at the hardware store, from a patrol deputy who said too much while buying coffee. By nightfall, the town that had spent 2 years looking at Owen began turning, slowly and hungrily, toward Sloane Vetter. Grace Bell refused at first. She came to the sheriff's office the next morning in a raincoat, her gray hair pinned badly because her hands had not worked. "No," she told Valdez. "Sloane loved her. Sloane held me up." Valdez did not argue. There were facts that needed more tenderness than denial. She showed Grace the evidence photograph of the necklace, not the worst close-ups, only the pendant in the container. Grace touched the picture, not the paper itself, but the air above it. "That's Mara's," she said. "Yes. She was wearing it. Yes. And it was in Sloane's frame. Yes." Grace sat for a long time. Outside Valdez's office, phones rang, printers clicked. Somebody laughed too loudly at the front desk, and then lowered his voice. Grace stared at the pendant until the etched swallow blurred. "When Mara was 12, she said, she lost that necklace at the county pool. We were there until they closed, looking in lockers and drains. She cried so hard the lifeguard opened the pump room. We found it caught in a filter basket with hair and leaves. After that, she would touch it whenever she was nervous, like checking that she was still herself." Valdez wrote that down, not because it was evidence, but because evidence without memory could become too clean. The second investigation did not move with the frantic energy of the first. It moved like someone unthreading a knot without breaking the string. Every assumption had to be removed and examined. Every helpful thing Sloane had done 2 years earlier had to be considered again under a colder light. The messages from Mara's phone were sent from within a shifting tower range, but the timestamps lined up with something the first investigation had not requested: the security logs from the building across the alley from Vetter Frames. In the original week, the insurance office next door had claimed its camera system was down from the storm. That had been partly true. The front camera had lost video. The rear camera, aimed at the shared alley, had recorded motion-triggered clips to a local drive that nobody had collected because the owner thought it faced only trash bins. The drive had been replaced after a remodel and placed in a cardboard box with old routers, where it sat until Detective Reese asked for everything. The footage was grainy and angled through rain, but it showed Sloane's back door opening at 7:19 the night Mara vanished. Two figures emerged. One wore a light top and dark pants. The other wore a green coat. They stood close together, not like friends saying goodbye, not like strangers, but like people trying to keep an argument from spreading into the alley. The audio was only wind and water, yet Valdez could see the green-coated figure pull away. The smaller figure caught at the front of the coat. The green-coated figure turned sharply. Something flashed at her throat. Then both moved out of frame. At 7:31, the back door opened again. Sloane stepped into the alley alone, wearing the canvas apron. She looked toward the street, toward the camera she did not know was recording, then down at her hands. She went back inside. At 8:14, the rear door opened a third time. Sloane backed out carrying one end of a long roll wrapped in brown paper, the kind used for oversized prints. The other end dragged until she adjusted her grip. The roll was too thick for a print and bent slightly in the middle. She loaded it into the back of her delivery van. The clip ended before the van left. Valdez watched it 3 times without speaking. Reese stood beside her, arms folded. "That's enough for a warrant?" "It's enough for questions," Valdez said. "I want the rest." The rest came in pieces. The shop's card reader showed no customer transactions after 5:44 that evening, though Sloane had told deputies she was finishing a rush order until 10. Her phone stayed connected to the shop Wi-Fi from 6:02 until 10:12, but the accelerometer data, obtained from a cloud backup she had forgotten to disable, showed almost no movement during the period when she claimed to be calling and pacing and searching. It looked as if the phone had been left on a counter. Mara's phone, never recovered, had sent the final messages from somewhere close enough to Gable Street that the old tower maps could not exclude the shop. At 8:47, a traffic camera on Mill Road captured Sloane's delivery van heading east, away from the turntable and toward the Canal Flats. The first investigators had seen that van on a different camera at 9:32, passing back into town. But Sloane had said she went looking for Mara after becoming worried. In the panic of the first night, that explanation had fit. Now it did not. Valdez and Reese searched Vetter frames 2 days after the necklace surfaced. The shop looked too orderly, as if it had been expecting company for years. The front room held sample corners, invoice books, framed family portraits waiting for pickup. The back room held blades, clamps, mat boards, rolls of paper, glass sheets, and bins of hardware labeled in Sloane's careful hand. In a drawer beneath the fitting table, an evidence technician found a pair of old pliers with a nick in one jaw. The nick was the right shape to make a tiny crescent mark on a soft gold clasp. That alone would not matter. Sloane had told police she once fixed Mara's necklace. In the floor seam beneath the fitting table, however, the technician found a dark fiber wedged under old glue. It matched the green wool blend from Mara's coat. Behind the baseboard near the sink, where mop water had not reached, another technician found a faint reddish stain. It tested presumptively positive for blood. Later, the lab would identify it as Mara's, degraded by cleaning, but not erased. Sloane was not arrested that day. Valdez wanted to know where Mara was before Sloane had a lawyer standing between them and the answer. They brought Sloane in voluntarily, and she came with the same composure that had once made her grief convincing. She wore a cream sweater and small silver earrings. No necklace. Her lawyer had not yet arrived because she had not called one. That was either confidence or a mistake. Valdez placed a photograph of the recovered necklace on the table. Sloane looked at it for a long time. "I thought finding it would help," she said. "It has. I mean, help Grace. It may still." Sloane swallowed. "I don't know how it got in the frame. We have video from the alley." The room changed. Not visibly, not enough for a jury, but Valdez saw the shift. Sloane's shoulders lowered a fraction, as if a string had been cut. "What video?" The night Mara disappeared. You and Mara behind your shop. You carrying something to your van. Sloan looked at the wall instead of the photograph. I carry things to my van every day. Not like this. What do you want me to say? The truth. Sloan laughed once without humor. People always think truth is one thing, like a key. It's not. It's a pile of broken things everyone keeps stepping around. That was the first sentence she had spoken since the necklace that sounded like the woman behind the crying voice on the 911 call. Not rehearsed. Not useful. Tired. Valdez let the silence gather. Sloan did not confess. She asked for a lawyer after 16 minutes, but before she stopped talking, she said one thing that shifted the search. You should have asked Mara what she was doing to me, Sloan said. It was ugly enough and personal enough to matter. Mara Bell's life had been examined 2 years earlier through the lens of danger from Owen. Her bank accounts, phone records, school emails, and apartment had been searched for signs of fear. They had not been searched deeply for signs of conflict with Sloan. Now Valdez looked again. The first clue was not dramatic. It was a certified letter from a private lender, found in a box of papers Grace had packed from Mara's desk, and never opened because paperwork seemed indecent after a disappearance. The letter warned that Mara Bell was delinquent on a business guarantee connected to Vetter frames. Grace had never seen it. Mara had never mentioned signing it. The signature on the guarantee looked like hers at first glance, but under magnification, it carried a stiffness in the loops, the hesitation of someone copying rhythm rather than writing from muscle. The loan had been issued 16 months before Mara vanished. It was for $42,000, secured against future receivables from Sloan's shop, and guaranteed by Mara as a silent partner. The money had kept Vetter frames open after a failed expansion into custom mirrors. Sloan had missed payments. The lender had contacted Mara. Mara had pulled a copy of the paperwork. 3 days before she vanished, she had searched online for forged guarantor police report and small business loan identity theft friend. The second clue was in Mara's school email. On the afternoon of her disappearance, she had sent herself a scan from the staff copier. The attachment had been overlooked because it was named with a string of numbers. It showed a page from Sloan's loan application, including a photocopy of Mara's old driver's license. Across the bottom, in Mara's handwriting, were the words, "Ask S directly. Record everything if she denies." Mara had not gone to meet Owen. She had gone to Vetter frames. That discovery did not absolve Owen completely in the eyes of everyone. Suspicion, once planted, has roots that do not pull out cleanly. But it gave Valdez the first clear motive that did not require guessing at old romance or rage. Sloan had been desperate. Mara had found out. A friendship praised on television had been cracking behind closed doors. The practical problem was still the largest one. Without Mara's body, prosecutors would hesitate. Without a confession, Sloan could claim Mara confronted her, left alive, and someone else killed her. The necklace proved contact and concealment, but not the final act. The video showed a roll in the van, but not what was inside. The blood in the shop could be explained as an accident, a cut hand, a nosebleed, anything an imaginative defense could arrange around reasonable doubt. Valdez went back to the van. Sloan had sold it 9 months after Mara disappeared to a landscaper in Bexley County. The landscaper had driven it until the transmission failed, then parked it behind a greenhouse where mice nested in the glove compartment and rain came through a crack in the windshield. The current owner was irritated when detectives arrived with a warrant, then excited when he realized the van might be on television. He had removed the rear mats years ago, he said. No, he did not know where they went. Maybe the dump, maybe under the potting benches. Reese found one mat curled behind stacked trays of seedlings. It was stiff with mud and fertilizer. The lab found a small triangular chip of black mat board embedded in it. the same brand Sloan used in 2019. They found a pale thread consistent with brown packing paper. They found no useful blood. Time had eaten the cleanest answers. Valdez returned to the Mill Road traffic camera stills. The van heading east at 8:47, back into town at 9:32. 45 minutes. Not enough time to drive far, dig, hide, clean, and return. Unless the place had already been prepared. Unless the hiding place was close. She spread maps across the conference table. Gable Street, the turntable, the old canal, Mill Road, the flats, the abandoned warehouses, the flooded gravel ponds, the defunct nursery, the row of boat sheds built by companies that no longer existed. She marked the camera times, the tower coverage, the likely speed on wet roads. The radius tightened around a forgotten strip of canal east of town known as Heron Cut. There had once been 5 boat sheds along Heron Cut, each with a narrow dock and a storage cellar dug into the bank. 3 had collapsed. 1 had been converted into a fishing club. The 5th was owned on paper by veteran son Fine Carpentry, a dissolved business belonging to Sloan's late father. It had not appeared in the first property search because Sloan did not own it personally, and the company records listed a mailing address that no longer existed. Taxes had been paid automatically from an old account holding enough money to keep the county from asking questions. Valdez learned that from a clerk named Myra Gant, who had worked in the assessor's office for 31 years and remembered everything except where she left her glasses. Myra said, "Funny thing, someone requested a duplicate key permit for that property not long before Mara Bell went missing." "Who?" Myra turned the monitor. The request had been made under Sloan Vetter's name 6 weeks before the disappearance. The reason listed, insurance inspection. Valdez felt the case settle around that line. Heron Cut was quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful. The old canal ran narrow there, green-black under leaning sycamores. The boat shed stood back from the water, its roof patched in rusted tin, its doors chained but not tightly. In the reeds beside the dock, beer cans floated with leaves. A heron lifted itself from the shallows when the search team arrived and moved down the bank with slow, offended wings. Inside, the shed smelled of damp wood, old oil, and the mineral cold of earth under boards. The main room held broken oars, a cracked fiberglass canoe, stacks of mildewed shutters, and carpenter's clamps hanging from nails. At first glance, it looked unused. Then Reese pointed to faint parallel marks in the dust, as if something heavy had once been dragged toward the rear. The storage cellar was beneath a trap door hidden under warped plywood and a pile of rotted life jackets. The chain on the trap door was new compared with everything around it. The padlock was not. One of Sloan's keys, taken from her shop under the warrant, opened it. Valdez did not go down first. She let the evidence team descend with lights and masks. She stood above, listening to the careful movements below, the creak of ladder rungs, the low exchange of professionals trying to keep their voices neutral. When one of them said her name, she closed her eyes once, then opened them. They found Mara in the cellar, not buried deep, not hidden with theatrical cruelty, but concealed behind a false partition made from old cabinet doors and sheets of warped plywood. The remains were wrapped in layers of brown framing paper and a canvas drop cloth from Vetter frames. The green coat was there, decayed by damp, but still recognizable by its buttons. One pocket held Mara's keys, another held a small digital recorder, corroded, its battery dead, its casing cracked but intact enough to be sent to the lab. Grace Bell wasn't told over the phone. Valdez and a victim advocate went to her house on Sycamore Lane, where the porch light still burned in daylight because Grace had forgotten to turn it off. Grace saw their faces through the storm door and gripped the handle before they spoke. "Is she coming home?" Grace asked. Valdez had prepared words. They left her. "We found her," she said. Grace made a sound so soft it hardly counted as sound at all. Then she nodded, as if someone had given her an instruction she knew she had to follow. She sat at the kitchen table beneath a calendar still open to the wrong month. The house smelled of coffee and furniture polish. On the refrigerator, a photograph of Mara at 17 held a blue ribbon from a science fair, her smile full of metal braces and certainty. Valdez told Grace only what she needed to know. The place, the certainty, the necklace, the fact that Mara had not left. Grace listened with both hands flat on the table. When Valdez said they had found Mara's keys in her coat, Grace whispered. She kept them. It was not clear whether she meant Mara kept the keys, or the world kept Mara waiting, or Sloane kept a friend in the dark for 2 years while standing beside her mother in the light. The recorder changed the case from strong to undeniable. It took specialists 9 days to recover the audio. Most of it was hiss, distortion, and fragments of movement. Mara had turned it on before entering the shop, perhaps remembering the note she had written to herself. Record everything if she denies. The device must have been in her coat pocket during the confrontation. It did not capture every word. It captured enough. Sloane's voice came first, thin and irritated. "You don't understand what they'll do," Mara answered, closer to the microphone. "I understand my name is on a loan I never signed. I was going to fix it. You used my license. I was going to fix it. You sent them my tax forms, Sloane." Then a sound like a chair scraping. Mara again. "I'm going to the sheriff's office, tonight." Sloane said something the lab could not clarify. Then louder. "After everything I did for you, you're going to ruin me over paper?" "This isn't paper. This is my life." There was more movement, both voices overlapping. Mara said, "Let go." Sloane said, "Give me the copies." Mara said, "Don't touch me." Then came a sharp crack, not loud, not cinematic, a sound small enough to belong to a falling frame or a dropped tool. After that, the recording became breath, rustle. Sloane sang Mara's name again and again, in a voice that did not sound like anger anymore. The recording did not capture a deliberate plan. It captured a confrontation, a struggle, and the beginning of a choice. Prosecutors later argued that the death might have begun in panic, but everything after it was intention. Staging messages, moving Mara, hiding the body, planting suspicion on Owen, comforting Grace, sealing the necklace inside a frame, and letting a town mourn in the wrong direction. Sloane was arrested outside Vetter Frames on a Monday morning. She had opened the shop at 9, turned the sign to come in, and set a customer's wedding portrait on the counter. 2 deputies entered, followed by Valdez. Sloane looked from one face to another and seemed, for the first time since the 911 call, completely unsurprised. "Did you find her?" she asked. "Yes," Valdez said. Sloane closed her eyes. A car passed outside, tires hissing on damp pavement. Somewhere in the back room, Calla Rowe dropped a metal ruler and began to cry. At the station, Sloane asked for her lawyer immediately. She did not confess that day. She did not apologize. She sat with her hands folded and looked at the wall clock as though time had become an object she could study from the outside. But after the arrest, the story she had built began to collapse under its own careful weight. Investigators learned she had bought a prepaid phone the afternoon before Mara vanished. The phone had activated near the shop and connected once to Mara's number, then never again. Sloane had used it to send an anonymous tip 3 months into the investigation, claiming Owen owned a hunting cabin near the gravel pit. The tip had wasted 4 days and convinced half the town that the sheriff's office had almost found something. She had also searched for Mara's voicemail password 2 weeks after the disappearance, then deleted the search history badly enough that it survived in a browser sync. She had withdrawn cash from the business account in the exact amount Owen said he had found in an envelope under his truck wiper the month after the vigil, along with a note telling him to leave Briar Glen if he wanted peace. Owen had thrown the note away because he thought it came from one of Mara's relatives. He had kept the cash because he was broke and ashamed. Shame had protected Sloan almost as well as intelligence. Owen's shame kept him from telling the truth about his alibi. On the night Mara vanished, he had not been at the Chapel Lane rental the whole time. He had spent part of the evening at a motel outside Briar Glen with a married woman whose children attended Mara's school. He lied because the truth would have damaged people who had nothing to do with Mara's disappearance. His lie made him look like a killer. Sloan knew enough about him to predict it. She knew he would hide anything that made him seem small. Grace Bell's shame protected Sloan too, in a quieter way. Grace had resented Owen and wanted him to be guilty because guilt gave her anger a body. She had accepted Sloan's comfort because comfort was rare, and because Sloan knew how Mara took her coffee, which sweaters she hated, which songs made her leave a room. Later, when people asked how she did not know, Grace would answer with a steadiness that made them stop asking, because I needed her to be who she said she was. The trial did not happen quickly. Sloan's attorney challenged the search of the frame, the recovery of the alley footage, the interpretation of the recorder, the chain of custody on the necklace, the forensic conclusions drawn from materials found in a shop that had handled Mara's photographs and personal items for years. The legal motion stretched across months. In that time, Briar Glen learned to live with the second version of the story and found it harder than the first. It was easier to believe in a dangerous ex-boyfriend at a dark turntable than in a friend who made coffee for search volunteers while knowing where the missing woman was. The frame became an object people talked about in low voices. It had hung in the library reading room while children did homework beneath it, and retirees read newspapers beside it. It had held the necklace in the wall of its neat walnut edges through story hour, budget meetings, rainstorms, summer reading contests, and the first anniversary of the second year. That was the part that unsettled people most. Not only that Sloan had hidden evidence, but that she had hidden it in a thing meant to preserve memory. She had made a frame for grief and placed the truth inside it, sealed away, close enough for everyone to see, and impossible for anyone to touch. Valdez visited the library once after the evidence had been removed. The Canal Bridge photograph was gone, leaving a pale rectangle on the wall where sunlight had not faded the paint. Beth Ansel had taped a note there saying the local history shelf was being rearranged. Valdez stood in the quiet and thought about how often investigations depend on ordinary people doing ordinary things. A volunteer with a craft knife, a clerk who remembers a key permit, a mother who keeps a box of papers she cannot bear to open, a camera no one bothered to ask for. Cases did not break open from one miracle. They broke from pressure applied again and again until the lie could no longer keep its shape. Sloan eventually changed her plea. It happened the week before jury selection, after the judge ruled the recorder admissible and allowed prosecutors to show the alley footage in full. By then, the forensic report on the necklace had also improved. A second lab, using more sensitive testing, had identified the female contributor beneath the bent pendant loop as Sloan. The state did not need it to prove she had touched the necklace. She had admitted fixing it years earlier. But the location of the material mattered. It was under damage that had occurred during the struggle, sealed beneath dried blood and old fibers. It placed her hand on the necklace at the moment it broke. The plea hearing filled the courtroom. Grace sat in the front row between Valdez and Mara's aunt. Owen sat near the back, thinner than he had been 2 years earlier. His shoulders hunched as if expecting someone to tell him he did not belong even in his own exoneration. Sloan entered in a gray suit with her hair cut shorter. She looked neither monstrous nor pitiful. She looked like a woman who had spent 2 years moving through rooms built from the same lie and had finally reached the last one. The judge asked whether she understood the charges. Sloan said yes. asked whether she wished to plead guilty to manslaughter, obstruction, evidence tampering, identity fraud, and unlawful disposal of human remains. She said yes again, the word barely audible. The prosecutor read the factual basis into the record. The words were clean and procedural, almost bloodless. Sloan forged Mara's signature. Mara confronted Sloan at Vetter Frames. A struggle occurred. Mara suffered a fatal injury. Sloan failed to seek medical help. Sloan transported Mara to Heron Cut, concealed her body, used Mara's phone to create misleading messages, reported Mara missing, and directed suspicion toward Owen Trask. Sloan concealed Mara's necklace inside a picture frame, later donated to the Briar Glen Public Library. When the judge asked Sloan if that was accurate, she looked toward Grace for the first time. "I didn't mean for her to die," Sloan said. Grace did not move. "I know that doesn't matter enough," Sloan added. The judge repeated the question. "Is the statement accurate?" Sloan looked down. "Yes." There was no gasp. No one shouted. The courtroom had already spent its surprise. What remained was heavier. At sentencing, Grace read from a folded paper covered in corrections. She had written several versions and discarded all of them because each made her sound either too forgiving or too cruel. In the end, she wrote what she could carry. "You let me love you while you knew," she said, facing Sloan. "You sat at my table. You drank from Mara's mug. You helped me choose photographs for posters. You watched me blame a man because that made it safer for you. You did not only take my daughter, you borrowed my grief and used it as a place to hide." Sloan bowed her head. Grace continued. "I used to think the worst night of my life was the night Nina called and said Mara's car had been found. Then I thought it was the day Sergeant Valdez told me Mara was in that cellar. But the worst part was learning that the person holding my hand had already decided I would never get the truth from her." Her voice held. That was what made it devastating. Owen did not speak at the hearing. He submitted a statement through the prosecutor, asking only that the records show he had not harmed Mara Bell. The judge said it aloud. The words did not repair 2 years of suspicion, but they entered the official record and stayed there. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Owen stood under the overhang while reporters called his name. Grace walked past him, stopped, and turned back. "I'm sorry," she said. Owen looked as though he had expected anger more than apology. He nodded once. "Me too." They did not embrace. The story did not need that. Some damage does not become beautiful because truth arrives. Mara was buried in late October, under a clear sky that felt almost indecent after so much rain in the memory of the case. The cemetery stood on a hill above Briar Glen, where the canal looked narrow and harmless in the distance. Students from North Briar Middle lined the path with white paper birds. Grace carried the recovered necklace in a small evidence envelope until the service began. It had been cleaned only enough for handling. The chain remained bent, the clasp still broken. The pendant's swallow was visible again. At the graveside, Grace did not place the necklace in the casket. She had thought she would, but when the moment came, she kept it in her hand. Mara had worn it to feel anchored. Now Grace needed that more than the dead did. Later, she asked a jeweler in another town to repair the chain without smoothing away the marks. The jeweler called twice to confirm. Most people wanted damage hidden. Grace said no. The break was part of the truth. The necklace had outlasted the lie because it carried what Sloan could not frame, seal, or explain away. Vetter Frames never reopened. The sign came down in winter. For a while, the front window remained empty, except for pale rectangles, where photographs had once shielded the display wall from sun. People still glanced at the shop when they passed, not because they expected to see Sloan, but because certain places keep asking to be understood. The alley behind it was repaved. The insurance office installed a new camera over the back door. The bakery next door became a tax service with plastic plants in the window. The library rehung the canal bridge photograph in a plain metal frame chosen by Beth Ansell. No plaque, no ceremony. It returned to the reading room quietly because the town had learned that memory did not become safer by decorating it. Sergeant Valdez kept a copy of the 911 call in the file, along with the lab reports, the footage, the recorder transcript, and a photograph of the necklace as Beth had found it. Sometimes new deputies asked about the case when training turned to missing adults and false narratives. Valdez would tell them to listen to the call, not for the crying, but for the structure. Sloan had sounded frightened because she was. That was the part people misunderstood. Lies are not always told in calm voices. Sometimes they are told by people shaking so hard they can barely hold the phone. Sometimes the fear is real, but it is fear of being found out, fear of consequences, fear that the story will not move fast enough to outrun the facts. Sloan had given the dispatcher clothing, habits, names, and a suspect. She had not sounded like a villain. She had sounded like a friend. That was why the lie lived as long as it did. The town did not stop telling Mara's story after Sloan went to prison, but the shape changed. It no longer began with Owen at the turntable. It began with Mara walking into a frame shop with a recorder in her pocket and a copied loan document in her bag. It began with a woman deciding that a friendship did not excuse betrayal. It began with the smallest act of courage, the kind that rarely feels like courage to the person doing it. Mara had gone to ask for the truth, and the truth had cost her everything. 2 years later, it came back from the dark space behind a photograph, tangled in a broken chain. And once it did, every careful edge Sloan Vetter had built around her story came apart.